Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when getting sick didn't mean popping pills or sipping orange juice. It meant praying, purging, and probably dying anyway. The Middle Ages. A magical period when science was astrology, hygiene was superstition, and if you lived past 30, you were either royalty or a witch. So, dim the lights, grab a warm blanket and maybe a crucifix, and let's ease into tonight's tale of coughing, bleeding, and medieval medicine. Spoiler: the cure was often worse than the disease. Chapter 1. The Disease Starter Pack. Let's set the stage. You're a medieval peasant. You wake up on a straw mattress that's about 30% straw and 70% fleas. Your house is a single room, the floor is made of compacted dirt, and your pillow, if you have one, is a bag of oats that already started sprouting. You cough, it sounds wet. It tastes like regret. You've got a problem. Your skin is blotchy, your joints feel like they're made of splintered chair legs. You sneezed blood yesterday. You tried to blame it on the soup, but you haven't had soup in 3 days. Your fingers are cold, your breath is hot, and you're starting to hallucinate slightly. Your neighbor just turned into a goat. Probably. Congratulations, you're sick. But what does that mean in the Middle Ages? It could be anything. There's no WebMD to help you panic scroll through your symptoms. There's no doctor you can call. There's just you, your symptoms, and whatever helpful advice your neighbor Agnes has, which usually involves beetles or burying turnips under the full moon. Let's go through the greatest hits. The Plague, aka the Black Death, aka the literal end credits. Ah, yes, the Plague. You knew we had to start here. The Black Death killed somewhere between 75 to 200 million people in the 14th century. That's not a typo. Entire villages vanished. Cities turned into ghost towns. The symptoms were like a horror film directed by bacteria. You'd get fever, vomiting, delirium, and then, just when things couldn't get worse, your lymph nodes would swell up into buboes the size of eggs. These lovely, pus-filled nodules would appear in your armpits, groin, and neck. Then they'd burst. And let's not gloss over that part. Imagine lying in your filthy bed as the local priest swings incense over your sweaty body, while you pray your buboes don't pop like disgusting balloons full of death jelly. Too late. They did. Everyone in the room screams. Your aunt faints. Your cousin starts gagging. You, meanwhile, begin composing your will in your head, which mostly consists of, "Please don't let them bury me next to that guy who smells like pickled despair." By the time you realized what was happening, you were already a walking corpse. And the best part? No one knew what caused it. People blamed bad smells. Jewish communities. Yep, scapegoating in full force. God's wrath. Saturn being in a bad mood. Cats, which ironically they started killing, thus increasing the rat population and making it worse. Medical advice included drinking crushed emeralds, sitting in sewers to balance out the poison, or cutting open your buboes and praying for the best. Some doctors even recommended carrying a bouquet of herbs under your nose at all times. If it smelled nice, maybe it would trick the disease into thinking you were too fancy to infect. Fun fact: plague doctors wore beaked masks filled with lavender and mint. You know, to mask the smell of decomposing bodies. Fashionable and futile. Leprosy, aka please ring the bell of shame. If the plague didn't get you, maybe leprosy would. Leprosy wasn't just a disease. It was a social death sentence. If you caught it, you didn't get sympathy. You got bells, literal bells. You had to walk around ringing them so others knew to stay away, Your skin would become patchy and numb. Your nerves would stop working. You'd lose fingers, toes, and sometimes even your nose. And if the physical toll wasn't bad enough, the emotional toll was crueler. Communities cast you out. Families disowned you. Priests warned others not to touch you unless they wanted to share your fate. You became the walking version of unsubscribe. Most people didn't understand how it spread. They just knew you were unclean, so they chucked you into a leper colony on the edge of civilization, gave you a Bible, and hoped Jesus sorted it out. If you were lucky, the local monks would toss you soup. If you were unlucky, they just tossed you prayers. Interestingly, some people with leprosy lived for decades, but that didn't help the stigma. If you were sick and poor, you were cursed. If you were sick and rich, you were struggling nobly. Either way, no one wanted to sit next to you in church. Fevers, aka probably the devil. Let's say you just have a fever. No buboes, no rot. Just the kind of fever that makes your sheets smell like despair and your brain feel like boiling cabbage. In the modern world, you'd take acetaminophen and binge-watch TV. In medieval Europe, you had options. Blame the wind, blame your sins. Blame a witch. Get bled by a man with a dull knife and questionable hygiene. Fevers were often seen as your body burning out impurity, but if it got too high, clearly a demon was inside you. Cue the chants. Cue the holy water. Cue the priest muttering Latin while smacking you lightly with a crucifix. Some doctors would wrap you in wet cloths and sit you next to a fire, because clearly the cure for being too hot was more hot. Others rubbed you with vinegar, wine, or oil mixed with spices. One method included tying a live chicken to your feet. Yes, a chicken. For science, if your fever broke, they said the cure worked. If you died, they said your soul was finally at peace. Win-win, apparently. Tuberculosis, aka the slow goodbye. This one took its sweet time. You'd start with a cough. Nothing dramatic. Then your chest would tighten. You'd start coughing blood. Over weeks or months, you'd lose weight, strength, and the will to live. And all the while, you'd be spreading it like a medieval germ sprinkler. It was often romanticized in literature. A pale, delicate woman coughing into a lace handkerchief. TB. The reality was far less poetic. You'd waste away in your corner of the house while the rest of your family pretended not to notice your organs failing like a collapsing bakery shelf. At some point, your family would stop asking if you were feeling better. They'd start asking if you had any last requests. Some people made it months, some years. Everyone around them wore garlic or carried religious relics. It didn't help. By the time you were too weak to sit up, someone was already measuring your feet for the burial shroud. Smallpox, measles, and the greatest hits. Tour. Let's not forget the viral party pack. Smallpox gave you a face like a dried-out orange peel. Measles made your skin erupt in itchy misery. Neither came with a warning. One day, you were picking turnips. The next, you looked like someone who lost a fight with a flaming porcupine. For smallpox, some cultures tried blowing powdered scabs up people's noses to build immunity. You read that right. Scab snorting. Early science was bold and also disgusting. Even when you survived these illnesses, you didn't walk away unscathed. Scars, blindness, lifelong complications. But hey, at least you weren't dead. In the Middle Ages, that counted as winning. And these were just the common threats. We haven't even touched on ergot poisoning, hallucinations from moldy rye, dysentery, good luck finding clean water, or childhood diseases that wiped out half the village before puberty. So there you are, covered in hives, sweating like a pig in a tabard, vomiting into a bucket you share with 3 other people, and trying to remember if you ate a bad mushroom or if your soul is being punished for stealing a pie. You're sick. And in the Middle Ages, that's a dangerous place to be. Not just because of the disease, but because of what came next. The cures. Which brings us to our next chapter. Chapter 2. Bleed the evil. Out. South. You've got a fever, or plague, or mysterious boils. What's the plan? Drink water? Rest? Of course not. You need to bleed, obviously. Welcome to the greatest medical idea in medieval Europe, bloodletting. The logic was rooted in humoral theory, an ancient idea that your body was a delicate soup made up of 4 fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Too much of one, you're doomed. Got a headache? Too much blood. Feeling sad? Black bile problem? Melancholy from your neighbor's turnip harvest? Probably your spleen. Enter the barber surgeon. Yes, your local haircut guy. He didn't just do bowl cuts, he was also your go-to for slicing open veins. A medieval multitasker. The red and white barber pole? That's not just festive candy cane design, red for blood, white for bandages, festive and traumatic. Let's walk through your medieval medical experience. Step 1. Find a guy with a knife. You go see the barber surgeon. He greets you with a smile that suggests he enjoys his job a little too much. He rolls up your sleeve, pulls out a blade that was last cleaned during the reign of Charlemagne, and selects a vein like he's choosing his favorite sausage. There's no sterilization, no gloves, no antiseptic. Just good old-fashioned steel in a bowl to catch the red stuff. If you're lucky, he'll aim for the arm. If he's feeling artistic, the neck. He makes a cut. You gasp, blood pours. The bowl fills. He watches your face closely, not out of concern, but to see how long he has before you faint. And if he's in a rush, no problem. He'll prop you up with a stool and let gravity do the rest. Sometimes there was no bowl, just a cloth to soak it up. That same cloth might have been used yesterday and last week. You flinch, wince, and bleed into oblivion. Congratulations, you're now officially being treated. Step 2. Keep going until you feel lighter or dead. Bleeding was meant to balance your body, so they kept going. The average person could lose a pint of blood before things got concerning. The medieval surgeon would stop when you looked slightly more transparent or passed out. Some practitioners believed in seasonal bloodletting. That's right, it had a schedule. Spring was a popular time because nothing says new beginnings like draining your life essence into a bucket. Others prescribed regular bleedings to prevent illness. That's right, preventative medicine, medieval style. Weaken yourself preemptively, just in case the wind gets ideas. It's like setting your house on fire to keep it safe from arsonists. Elite nobles turned it into a ritual. Every month, fresh tunic, same vein. A performance of power and pseudoscience. Even monks wrote guides about how much to bleed and from where, with the scholarly tone of someone recommending a wine pairing. Other extraction methods. Leeches and hot cups. Didn't want to cut you? They'd slap a leech on you instead. Leeches were medieval mood rings. Doctors claimed they could sense bad blood and only drank what needed to be removed. The truth? They just sucked. Literally. Also, they escaped. Frequently. Imagine heading home and realizing a hungry worm is somewhere in your underpants. Elite physicians might use imported leeches, like they were rare spices. Fancy Latin names, custom containers, and everything. You weren't just sick, you were trendy. If that didn't appeal, there was cupping, placing heated glass or metal cups on your skin to create suction blisters. When the blisters formed, they'd slice them open to let out the blood. Congratulations, you've just signed up for medieval extreme skincare. Sometimes they used both methods at once, cupping and bleeding. At that point, it's less medical procedure and more blood-themed performance art. And if none of those worked, they'd try something called scarification, a nice word for repeatedly slicing shallow cuts all over your body to let the humors out. You basically got turned into a very confused zebra. What were they trying to cure again? Oh, right, your fever. Except now you're weak, dizzy, and can't stand up. But hey, the fever broke, mostly because your body gave up on functioning. Your color's gone, your vision's blurry, but the barber surgeon is thrilled. He shows you the bowl of blood and says it had a nice dark hue, which means the evil is gone. Or your oxygen. You're sent home with some advice: avoid wind. Eat cold foods, don't get emotional. But don't worry, they'll check in on you, and by that we mean your neighbors will peek in to see if your body's worth looting. More places to bleed. Some bleeding wasn't done through veins. No, medieval medicine got creative. Got hemorrhoids? Bleed from the rectum. Nosebleeds? Considered healthy. Ear infection? They might slice behind your ear to let the vapors out. Sore throat? Time to lance a tonsil. The body was treated like a wineskin. Poke the right spot and the illness drains like cheap ale. Bleeding from under the tongue was a favorite cure for mouth ailments. Just lift your tongue and snip. You're now drooling blood and unable to taste soup for a week. It was less treatment and more medieval dare. There were even astrological bleeding charts. Doctors consulted the stars to determine when and where to cut. If Mars was in Aries, you'd bleed from the forehead. If it was in Pisces, maybe the ankle. Medical astrology, because what your spleen really needs is moon logic. If the stars aligned, they might bleed you on the left foot to treat right-sided toothaches. Or maybe your ear pain was caused by Saturn being angry at your gallbladder. It made no sense, but it sounded impressive in Latin. And yet, it persisted. Did it work? Number, did they stop? Also, number. People swore by it. Kings were bled. Saints were bled. Regular people got bled on their lunch break. Hospitals had entire wings dedicated to bloodletting. Some noblemen did it weekly, like a spa appointment. One monk even documented bleeding himself over 100 times in 1 year. Spoiler, he didn't live to write the sequel. Even the Enlightenment didn't kill the trend. Doctors kept doing it through the 18th century. George Washington died after being bled of over 80 ounces of blood in a single day. Modern historians agree the treatment probably killed him faster than the original illness. Medieval doctors weren't malicious, just wrong. They really believed illness was about imbalance, that draining the red would restore the soul, that pain meant progress. In a weird way, bloodletting made sense to people who saw the body not as biology, but as philosophy. Bleeding wasn't just medicine, it was metaphor. But now you've bled from your neck, your ankle, your inner thigh for some reason, and your barber is suggesting one more cut just to be safe. You politely decline, or try to. It comes out as a weak gurgle. So, the next time you feel under the weather, remember, at least no one's tying a chicken to your feet or draining your blood because Jupiter says it's a good day for ankle bleeding. You survived Chapter 2. You're a pint lighter, a lot paler, and definitely not cured. Next up, let's talk about ingesting substances no human should ever eat. Onward to Chapter 3. Chapter 3. Eat this and regret everything. So you've bled yourself silly, your barber surgeon has moved on to another customer, possibly a goat, and yet, somehow, you're still sick. The sweating hasn't stopped. Your skin is developing textures normally reserved for dried fruit. Your soul feels slightly detached. Clearly, it's time for a different approach. Enter the medieval pharmacy. A dark wooden shelf in someone's damp kitchen holding vials of horror, baskets of rot, and a few very confused frogs. Welcome to Chapter 3, where medicine goes in your mouth and hope goes out the window. 1. The Medicine Cabinet from Hell. The average medieval apothecary didn't stock what you'd call FDA-approved substances. Instead, they offered the kind of recipes that sound like they were written during a fever dream by someone angry at both nature and people. Let's sample a few. Powdered toad, toasted over an open flame, ground into a fine powder and sprinkled into wine. Good for fevers, bad for staying alive. Crushed emeralds, taken for stomach pain, probably caused more stomach pain. Burned hedgehog ash, prescribed for urinary issues. Also worked as a warning sign that your healer was making things up. Goat dung mixed with honey, applied to wounds. A medieval healing salve that mostly just attracted flies and future regrets. Warm wine with eel liver for coughs. Presumably because once you drank it, you stopped talking. And if you had access to really advanced medicine, like the kind they saved for royals, you'd get a dose of something special. 2. Mercury. Drink it. Hot and die faster. Mercury. Liquid metal. The shiniest, most toxic thing you could possibly ingest. And yes, medieval physicians loved it. They thought it purged illness, reset your humors, and cleansed the soul. It was used for everything from syphilis to melancholy. Take it hot, take it cold, inject it into your ear canal if you're feeling spicy. Of course, the side effects included death, organ failure, madness, mouth ulcers that glowed in the dark, but those were considered minor setbacks. The important thing was you tried. One 15th century prescription involved boiling mercury with sulfur and vinegar, then gargling the mixture. Imagine explaining to your spouse why you now have glowing drool and a rapidly shortening lifespan. 3. The pigeon poultice. You've got a headache, a bad one, the kind that makes your teeth ache and your left eye twitch involuntarily. Time to apply a pigeon. Here's how. Take a live pigeon, split it down the middle, horizontally because obviously. Place the freshly opened bird directly on your head. Wait for the evil spirits to transfer into the bird. That's not a joke. That was a real prescription. The idea was that the living energy of the pigeon would draw out your illness. What it probably did was give you lice and a solid reason to sit quietly and contemplate your life choices. 4. Earth, clay, and anything that looked vaguely edible. Feeling off? Time to eat dirt. Clay was a popular medieval ingestible. Why? Because it absorbed poison, they thought, and because it was cheaper than imported herbs. Some types of clay were even sold by merchants who claimed to harvest them from holy hills. In some monasteries, monks would mix clay with wine, blessed salt, and a few strands of saintly hair, if available. The resulting paste was eaten during fevers, stomach aches, or mild spiritual crises. It did sometimes work, for diarrhea mostly, but only because it plugged you up like medieval cement. More questionable substances included chalk, limestone, charcoal ground with beer, rotten tree bark. Spiders, whole or powdered. Let that sink in. There were people willingly grinding spiders into powder and drinking them with ale, all because they had a cough. 5. Cannibal cures, the darkest corner. Let's step into the truly macabre. Yes, there were medieval cures that involved other people. Mummy powder, ground up Egyptian mummies, was prescribed for everything from headaches to epilepsy. Wealthy Europeans imported it by the jar. Apothecaries stocked it like aspirin. The fact that it was human remains didn't stop anyone. In fact, they believed the ancient age of the mummies made the powder stronger. If you couldn't afford the good stuff, try a freshly executed criminal. There were recipes for drying and powdering the skull of a man hanged at dawn. Mix with molasses and consume at sunset. Allegedly helped with seizures. Definitely helped with disturbing everyone around you. Blood of the freshly killed was also prized, for real. Spectators at public executions would rush the scaffold to dip handkerchiefs or cups in the blood. They'd drink it warm, believing it transferred the victim's life energy. This was less health care and more ritualistic snack time. 6. Kitchen nightmares, culinary medicine for the desperate and deranged. Let's say you're too squeamish for blood, too broke for crushed gemstones, and too sane for mummy dust. Good news. The kitchen is open, and medieval chefs/healers are ready to whip up a menu of edible disasters that blur the line between cure and crime. Common dishes included boiled cabbage and horse urine broth for clearing the sinuses and possibly clearing the entire room of people. Mouse pie, take a freshly killed mouse, bake it into a pastry, and serve warm. Said to cure bedwetting and toothaches, probably caused both. Dog fat stew, fat rendered from a black dog, mixed with onions and vinegar, used as a rub or eaten directly. Yes, that was an option. Fried liver of a red fox, best served with a dash of bile and a side of superstition. And if that wasn't wild enough, there were entire cookbooks devoted to edible cures. Some recipes were 90% food and 10% curse insurance, involving charms, incantations, or prayers muttered while stirring. Your average medieval soup wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble, a ritual, and sometimes an exorcism. Boil for 3 hours, chant Psalm 42, and do not look the chicken in the eyes. Real instructions, real consequences. 7. The Holy Hangover. Cures from monasteries and cloisters. Monasteries were the closest thing to research labs in medieval Europe, minus the lab coats and plus a whole lot of incense. Monks didn't just pray. They brewed, dried, mixed, and labeled herbs with alarming enthusiasm. Some of the earliest hospitals were monastic infirmaries, where you could receive a dose of Christian charity with a side of questionable pharmacology. Popular monk-made cures included a thimble of wine infused with nettles and holy water, effective against headaches, demons, and social anxiety, allegedly. St. Benedict's brew, a fermented grain drink used to treat moral disorder, which is monk speak for you're being weird again. Healing wafers, communion bread stamped with extra blessings. You ate these to cure disease, or just for the placebo carbs. While some monastic remedies had merit, herbal teas for sleep, honey for wounds, others were just optimism wrapped in scripture. Monks also believed in curing the soul to cure the body, which meant confessions, flagellation, and sometimes lying in a box overnight while people sang at you. And if none of that worked, clearly it was God's will you remained sick. 8. Stench-based remedies, inhaling and exhaling. Your way to health. You can eat your remedies, drink your remedies, smear your remedies, but don't forget to sniff them. Medieval folk believed disease was airborne, and bad smells were both a symptom and a cause. The worse something smelled, the more healing power it was suspected to have. Logic. Here are a few of history's most aggressive aromatherapy treatments. Burnt feathers, inhaled through the nose to combat headaches, or to make you wish you'd never been born. Boiled urine steam, for clearing the lungs. It also cleared the lungs of all dignity. Frankincense, myrrh, and sulfur, lit on altars, carried in pouches, or waved in your face during dramatic public blessings. Rotten onions mixed with vinegar, smeared on walls or worn around the neck. Smelled like despair. Allegedly cured plague, mostly cured friendships. In plague times, people stuffed herbs and flowers into their clothing, masks, and even their mouths. If you couldn't escape the disease, you could at least try to outsmell it. And in truly desperate times, people carried dead animals, yes, actual rotting carcasses into their homes, believing the stench would drive out evil spirits. Spoiler, it didn't. It just added more evil. 9. The zodiac ate my symptoms. Star-crossed cures. Before medicine was about chemistry, it was about cosmic vibes. Many medieval healers were also astrologers, believing that planetary alignments determined your physical health. Your liver was tied to Jupiter, your brain to the moon, and your bowels to Mars. Go figure. Treatments were tailored to your astrological sign, born under Virgo. You were prone to melancholy. Take saffron and a glass of goat's milk, stirred counterclockwise during sunrise. Aries with a cough. You need a poultice made of ram's blood and thistle, applied during a waxing moon. Taurus with bad dreams. Bathe in mint water, but only after Saturn exits the 4th house. If you were really unlucky, your birth chart and your symptoms aligned in a bad way. That meant you were cosmically doomed. A priest might intervene with a full lunar blessing or exorcism involving a wheel of cheese and 2 candles, not joking. Doctors even had zodiacal man charts, human outlines labeled with signs corresponding to different organs. These were used to decide where not to perform surgery. If a Venus was hovering near your spleen, nobody was allowed to touch your spleen, even if it was visibly leaking. 10. Trial by toad, frog, and lizard. If it moved, croaked, or looked vaguely magical, someone tried to heal with it. Toads and frogs were especially prized. Live toad in a sock, hung around your neck to draw out fever. Frog tied to the throat, used for sore throats. If it stopped croaking, the illness was gone. Or the frog suffocated. Either way, it was considered progress. Toad baked into ash, then blown into the nose to treat headaches. Because nothing says wellness like nostril toad dusting. Lizards, meanwhile, were thought to heal blindness. The treatment: catch one, burn it, crush it, mix it with rose oil, and rub it in your eyes. You read that right. Burned lizard eye balm. For vision. The only thing more painful than the cure was the logic behind it. Chapter 4. Smells like healing. Sort of. Let's say you've tried it all. Leeches, pigeons, drinking molten metal, and shockingly, you're still unwell. Time to try something subtler, something sophisticated. Something that doesn't involve cutting or swallowing toads. It's time to sniff your way to salvation. Medieval Europe had a theory. If bad air could make you sick, good air could make you well. Logical, right? In the same way that being hit by a cart means cuddling one will heal you. But this belief launched one of the weirdest medical movements in history: olfactory warfare. Welcome to the golden age of smell-based medicine, where if you couldn't fix your illness, you could at least mask it with the overpowering stench of desperation, burning herbs, or whatever happened to be rotting nearby. Doctors of the era believed miasmas, literally bad air, were responsible for everything from plague to moral decay. Entire cities were fumigated. Markets were shut down because of garlic vendors, and more than one monk blamed sinful odors for the collapse of civilization. Let's break down the most popular smell-based medical strategies. 1. Carry your own bouquet of hope and denial. If you were rich, you didn't just walk around with a handkerchief. You walked around with a pomander, a little scented orb filled with cloves, rosemary, and holy stuff. Think of it like a medieval air freshener meets aromatherapy grenade. Pomanders were worn around the neck, attached to belts, or tucked into sleeves. They didn't do much for disease, but your death scene smelled like a cursed fruitcake. Some were carved from precious metals and inlaid with jewels, because if you were going to die gasping for breath, you might as well do it in style. 2. Dr. Death and the Beak. Mask. The most iconic figure of plague medicine, the plague doctor. Cloaked in black leather, holding a stick to prod patients from a safe distance, and most importantly, wearing a long bird-like beak mask. Not just for drama, though it absolutely worked for intimidation. The beak was stuffed with herbs, flowers, vinegar-soaked sponges, and sometimes just whatever they could find. Mint, camphor, myrrh, cloves, dried rose petals, and occasionally a splash of wine for morale. The idea was to filter the air so the doctor wouldn't breathe in death vapors. It didn't work, but the aesthetic was strong. The plague doctor looked like something out of a nightmare, and was, for many, the last face they'd ever see. 3. Burn it all and hope for the best. Public health campaigns in medieval towns often amounted to one strategy: light something on fire. Fires were set in the streets to purify the air. Sulfur, pine, cedar, and even pitch were burned by the cartload. The smoke would billow down alleys, chase out merchants, blind goats, and, hopefully, scare off the plague. In homes, people burned resin, incense, and occasionally old shoes, which were said to ward off evil. Whether this was effective or just an early experiment in domestic terrorism is unclear. The idea was simple. If it hurts your nose, it must hurt the demons too. 4. Corpse flowers and dead mice. Smell cures didn't stop at the pleasant. In fact, the nastier the smell, the more potent the cure was believed to be. Some popular examples: rotting animal flesh placed in the center of the room to absorb disease. Dried dog dung crushed and mixed with vinegar to make a paste you could smear on doorposts, or directly onto sick relatives. A mouse roasted over herbs, then mashed and sniffed like some cursed incense. Why? Because the thinking went like this: if you could confuse the illness with a more powerful smell, it might leave. This is also why some people never bathed during outbreaks. They believed their natural stink would protect them. It didn't. 5. Nosebleeds on purpose. In case nothing was working, some healers recommended inducing a nosebleed with irritants, burnt wool, pepper, or crushed ivy. The bleeding was thought to release the poisonous air trapped in your skull. At worst, you fainted from blood loss. At best, you were momentarily distracted from the fact that you were still dying. In one case, a physician prescribed holding a dead hedgehog under the nose while bleeding from the ears. It's unclear what ailment this was meant to treat. Possibly being too alive. 6. Herbal hallucinations and garden warfare. If you were lucky enough to live near a monastery, or at least a peasant with access to a mildly aggressive herb garden, you were familiar with healing plants. Some of these genuinely had soothing properties. Others sent you on a celestial journey to visit Saint Peter via hallucination. Take henbane. Used in various poultices and incense blends, it was famous for two things: inducing unconsciousness and causing wild visions. Combined with wormwood or mandrake, it was less treatment and more witchcraft cocktail. Want to make it worse? Dry it, burn it, and inhale deeply. If your lungs didn't explode from the smoke, your brain would float away on a narcotic wind. Perfect for distracting a patient from their failing organs. Other contenders included rue, good for warding off witches, bad for pregnancy; angelica, allegedly blessed by angels, more likely to give you a rash; mugwort, used in incense and dreams, also found in cheap medieval love potions. If you were really desperate, you didn't sniff these. You brewed them into stank tea, or, if times were bleak, rubbed them into your armpits with animal fat. 7. Perfumed politics and class-based scents. Smell was also political. If you were wealthy, your body reeked of jasmine oil, clove pomanders, and imported sandalwood. If you were poor, you smelled like garlic, lard, and the anxiety of unwashed wool. This wasn't just fashion, it was medicine. Nobles believed they could fend off disease by out-scenting the commoners. During plagues, they locked themselves in perfumed rooms filled with burning juniper and silk soaked in rose water. They stuffed their pillows with cinnamon bark and misted their bed sheets with lily tincture. Meanwhile, peasants boiled old socks with rosemary and hoped the steam would drive out the ghosts. Doctors even wrote smell manuals. One guide claimed that, to ward off the Black Death, you should hold a sponge soaked in rose vinegar to your nose at all times. Change your bed sheets every day. Avoid garlic, onions, and widows. It's unclear if the last one was medical advice or just someone's very specific grudge. 8. Animal-based olfactory enhancements. Why stop at plants and poop when you can add wildlife to the mix? Cats were often associated with witches, but their fur was prized for attracting healing spirits. Rubbing a cat on your pillow was said to help with nightmares. Holding a cat up to your nose while sniffing camphor. Apparently good for seizures. Other smell enhancements included ferret musk glands, mixed with vinegar and sealed into jars. Boar breath, believed to reset the sinuses. No, we don't know how you caught one. Goat hair incense, used in rituals to expel foul spirits. Also, good for clearing the room. And if nothing worked, the family dog was sometimes used as a scent shield. Tie herbs around its neck and let it sleep near the sick. If the dog died, the cure had been effective, just on the wrong mammal. 9. Smell duels, scented exorcisms, and religious air battles. In especially competitive towns, smell became a civic sport. Rival physicians would compete by composing their own scent blends and hosting public sniffing sessions. Townsfolk would gather to compare which doctor's incense made their headaches vanish fastest, or made them faint first. Priests got in on the act too. Scented exorcisms were performed using holy herbs like hyssop, frankincense, and blessed olive oil burned on silver plates. The theory, the more sacred the smell, the faster it chased out devils. Bonus points if someone vomited during the ritual. That meant it was working. There were even stories of evil air clouds being fought with processional smell marches, long parades of monks swinging incense burners, flanked by children carrying lavender bundles. Think Macy's parade, but with more coughing. 10. The legacy of the nose. Did any of it work? Well, sometimes. A few herbs used in these remedies genuinely had antimicrobial properties. Burning juniper and rosemary could mildly disinfect air. Camphor and vinegar could slightly irritate the sinuses, but also clear congestion. Lavender could help people sleep. But the rest, mostly nonsense. Ritualized, perfumed, and flower-wrapped nonsense. Still, it left a legacy. The plague doctor mask became an icon. The use of aromatic oils persisted. And perfume? It exploded in popularity as people tried desperately to smell less medieval. In a world where medicine was mostly pain and guesswork, smell became a way to feel in control. If you couldn't cure your illness, at least you could fragrance it into something vaguely tolerable. So, next time you light a candle when you're feeling sick, remember, you're continuing a tradition that once involved burning goat hair and sniffing hedgehogs. But before we dive in, let's take a moment to share a true tale from the archives. A story passed down, half whispered, through crumbling records and suspiciously dramatic monks. Bonus. Chapter: The Apothecary's Apprentice, or How Not to Cure a Cough. A cautionary tale from the plague-ridden archives of Worms Hollow on the Bog. In the year 1349, in the small town of Worms Hollow on the Bog, lived a young apothecary's apprentice named Thomas. Eager, curious, and catastrophically underqualified, Thomas had read precisely 3 pages of a medical manual, 2 of which were recipes for ale. His master, Old Willem, was a man who believed garlic cured everything, including broken bones and moral failings. One foggy spring, when plague swept through the village, Old Willem took to his bed muttering, "The miasmas come for me." Thomas was left in charge. His first patient, Agatha, age 74, afflicted with a mysterious cough that smells like firewood. Thomas consulted the scrolls, misread the word myrrh as mire, and prescribed a poultice of swamp mud and pig's ear. Agatha's cough did not improve, but her skin did turn a fashionable green. Next came Thomas the tanner, suffering from pustules the size of God's disapproval. Thomas attempted a cure involving hot vinegar, powdered nettles, and chanting to the constellation Capricorn. It ended with the tanner unconscious and his eyebrows permanently gone. His masterpiece, however, was the pungent defense sphere. He gathered goat dung, thyme, and stale apple cider into a leather pouch, hung it from his belt, and declared he was now immune to all disease. He wasn't. He collapsed in the middle of market day after inhaling too deeply while adjusting the pouch. They buried Thomas beside Old Willem, under a tree that always smelled faintly of thyme and regret. The townsfolk remembered him fondly, not for his cures, but for his commitment. As the village priest said at the funeral, he meant well, just not accurately. Onward to next chapter, when curing the soul meant torturing the body. Chapter 5. Witchcraft, Astrology, and Holy Water. You've bled, sniffed, and eaten your way through every apothecary's nightmare, and still, somehow, you're sick. You've got chills, blisters, and possibly a demon. That can only mean one thing. The sickness isn't in your body, it's in your soul. Welcome to the Holy Trinity of medieval spiritual medicine: witchcraft, astrology, and holy water. When logic fails, and it always did, people turn to the stars, the saints, and the supernatural. Curing the body meant nothing if the soul was rotting like a damp turnip in a confessional. Let's begin with the simplest explanation for why you're ill. You made God mad. Sins, sickness, and celestial suspicion, In medieval thinking, sin was basically a disease with better manners. If you sinned, lied, cheated, skipped church, or had lustful thoughts about your neighbor's goat, you risked divine retribution in the form of boils, fever, or explosive diarrhea. Cures, not medical, moral. Confess, repent, fast, flagellate, and maybe donate a sheep to the nearest monastery. Doctors would sometimes prescribe prayer, pilgrimage, or penance herbs, usually bitter leaves that doubled as laxatives and spiritual metaphors. If that didn't work, clearly the problem wasn't just your sin, it was someone else's sorcery. The witch next door. Every village had one. The old woman with too many cats, a fondness for herbs, and a mysterious ability to make your soup curdle just by glaring at it. She was a healer, until someone got sicker, or crops failed, or a cow gave birth to something with too many legs. Then she was a witch. Witches were accused of causing illness by cursing livestock, poisoning wells, or dancing naked under full moons. This last one was mostly projection by inquisitors. Diary of a Midwife, Witch or Healer. Marjorie of Millstone Lane had delivered more babies than the town priest had sermons. She brewed teas from raspberry leaves for labor, packed nettle poultices for infections, and whispered prayers learned from her grandmother, not the church. When people got better, they called her blessed. When they didn't, they called her cursed. One winter, a lord's son died of fever. Marjorie was summoned, not for healing, but for trial. Her crimes? Unusual herbs, too many cats, and an unfortunate tendency to speak her mind. She was dunked in the river. She didn't float, but she also didn't drown. She just stood up, soaked and cold, and said, "Shall I deliver your next child or not?" They let her go, but they never quite looked her in the eye again. Trials were deeply scientific. Throw her in a river. If she floats, she's guilty. If she drowns, she's innocent and dead. Witchcraft was considered a spiritual infection. The cure? Burning, occasionally beheading. Rarely exile, always dramatic. Villagers would also preemptively protect themselves with charms. Bread marked with a holy cross. Nails hammered into thresholds. Urine jars buried at crossroads. Yes, spiritual protection often smelled like fear and stale pee. Medical astrology, diagnosis by moonlight. If the witches didn't get you, the planets might. Doctors consulted astrological charts before treatments. Your birth sign determined everything from your temperament to your bowel habits. Mars ruled the blood. Mercury, the nerves. Saturn, bones. Jupiter, gas. Got gout? Mercury's misaligned. Chronic headaches. Venus is sulking. Nosebleeds? Blame Mars and your poor choices. Physicians wouldn't cut or bleed a patient unless the stars approved. A poorly timed surgery could offend the cosmos and make your condition worse, or invite pestilence. There were guides, diagrams, and full books on which moon phase was best for tooth extraction. Spoiler, none of them. Exorcisms and demon eviction protocols. Some illnesses weren't caused by bacteria or bad air, they were caused by demons. Possession was taken seriously, especially if your symptoms included uncontrollable twitching, shouting in Latin, or bad table manners. Enter the exorcist. Clad in robes, armed with incense, and shouting enough scripture to peel paint, the priest would approach the afflicted with a crucifix, a Bible, a small bucket of holy water. Unlimited patience, or none at all. Rituals ranged from whispered prayers to full-blown performance art. Patients were chained to pews. Candles were lit. Latin was shouted. If the patient puked, twitched, or exploded into blasphemies, success. Sometimes the demon resisted. Then it was time for escalation. More water, more Latin, physical force. The community goat, don't ask. If the patient died, it was assumed the demon was vanquished. If they lived, they got a reputation, a few burn scars, and a great story for the next village fair. Pilgrimages and divine road trips. Not all spiritual cures were violent. Sometimes you just needed to walk across Europe on foot, sleep in ditches, and get blessed by a monk with excellent sandals. Pilgrimages were the medieval version of both therapy and punishment. Got a rash? Visit a saint. Lost your voice? Hike to a holy well. Your leg fell off? Crawl to Rome. Famous pilgrimage spots included Santiago de Compostela, Spain; Canterbury, England; Lourdes, France. Any church with a piece of a saint's femur. Once you arrived, you'd pray, touch the relic, donate money, and then pray your kidneys didn't fall out on the journey home. Some claimed miraculous healing. Others claimed mildly improved attitudes. Most just claimed blisters. Holy water and DIY sacraments. Holy water wasn't just for baptisms, it was for everything. You could sprinkle it on a wound, drink it, questionable; bathe in it, very questionable; mix it with herbs to make God's broth, extremely questionable. Some people wore small vials of it around their necks. Others added it to tea. One desperate soul reportedly boiled leeches in it, creating a theological stew best forgotten. Priests would bless everything: houses, food, even bedpans. They'd fling water at the sick like they were trying to win a spiritual water fight. If you coughed, sneezed, or looked suspiciously tired, out came the sprinkle. Miraculous cures were reported, mostly by people too polite to say otherwise. Sacred relics and saintly hairs. Nothing says health care like rubbing a bone fragment on your boils. Relics were holy objects tied to saints. Bones, teeth, cloth scraps, and suspiciously shiny pebbles were all sold, stolen, or borrowed for use in healing rituals. If you could touch a real relic, great. If not, you'd buy a replica and hope the placebo effect was contagious. Some healing rites involved pressing the relic to the forehead, chanting the saint's name 3 times, walking backward around a shrine while holding your breath. Results varied. Faith was mandatory. Logic was not. In short, spiritual medicine in the Middle Ages was a lot of smoke, chanting, and hope. It may not have cured your disease, but it gave your suffering meaning, and a front row seat to the wildest medical theater in history. Chapter 6. Accidentally Genius. Let's be honest, most medieval medicine was a parade of wild guesses, herbal hope, and the occasional goat-based incident. But buried beneath the superstition, astrology, and loud Latin chanting were moments, just moments of accidental brilliance. Because every now and then, a medieval healer stumbled onto something that actually worked. Not because they understood how or why, but because, like a broken clock, sometimes even medieval logic was accidentally on time. Welcome to the rare wins, the miracles that weren't miracles, the unintentional inventions that eventually turned into actual medicine. Honey, the sweet sticky antibiotic. Used to treat wounds, burns, and ulcers, honey was medieval gold. It didn't just smell better than dung poultices, it actually worked. Why? Because honey is naturally antibacterial, thanks to its low water content and enzyme-produced hydrogen peroxide. But did medieval doctors know that? Absolutely not. They just knew that if you smeared honey on a gash, it didn't rot as quickly, and sometimes people even got better. They also liked that it looked holy, felt expensive, and attracted fewer flies than swamp balm. Bonus: if your treatment failed, at least you died tasting something sweet. Willow bark, aspirin. Before aspirin, have a headache, joint pain, toothache? Peel some bark off a willow tree, boil it into a tea, and drink up. Medieval healers didn't know it, but willow bark contains salicin, the compound that modern aspirin is based on. And it did exactly what aspirin does: reduce inflammation and pain. Sure, the tea tasted like tree tears, but it sometimes stopped the screaming. That was good enough for medieval standards. This was one of the few remedies that wasn't just placebo, it was pharmaceutical gold, wrapped in bark, served in despair. Moldy bread, the penicillin prequel. Yes, they really did press moldy bread onto wounds. No, they didn't do it because they understood penicillin. They did it because they noticed it occasionally helped infections heal faster, and fewer people died when mold was involved. In modern terms, they were applying natural antibiotics, completely by accident, probably while trying to make a sandwich. This wasn't just country wisdom. Egyptian, Greek, and Roman physicians had versions of this too. It was one of the oldest, smelliest, and most unintentionally effective treatments in the medieval toolkit. Herbal heroes. Not all plants were liars. Among the endless herbs used for everything from demon banishment to constipation were a few that genuinely helped. Garlic. It smells like peasant breath, but it has antibacterial properties. Medieval folks used it to fight infections and ward off bad air. Accidentally helpful. Chamomile. Used for calming nerves, soothing stomachs, and helping people sleep. Still used today. Still smells like soggy optimism. Yarrow, a lesser-known hero, used to stop bleeding. It actually works. Soldiers sometimes carried it into battle. Mint, good for digestion, and for making you smell slightly less like despair. The herbalists got lucky with these. For every deadly dose of belladonna, there was a surprisingly effective mint leaf. Quarantine, isolation that actually helped. During outbreaks, especially the plague, some cities imposed quarantine, forcing ships, merchants, and travelers to wait before entering a town. Venice famously enforced a 40-day isolation period, 40 giorni, hence the word quarantine. This slowed the spread of disease, not because they understood pathogens, but because they feared contaminated air and cursed sailors. It worked anyway. Sometimes fear creates the right policy, even if it's driven by astrology and screaming. Monastic cleanliness. Accidental public health. Monks were some of the cleanest people in medieval Europe. Not because they feared germs, they feared damnation. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and they took it seriously. Many monasteries had basic sanitation, latrines, running water, hand-washing rituals. Some even boiled tools. Compared to the rest of medieval society, monks were basically germaphobes in robes. This led to lower disease rates inside monasteries. Clean robes, clean tools, and regular foot washing saved lives. Praise be. Isolation hospitals, medieval precursors to the ER. Leper colonies were awful, but they were also isolated. That isolation kept disease from spreading. Other medieval hospitals did the same, grouping sick people together and sometimes segregating by symptom. It wasn't done out of germ theory. It was done out of superstition and fear. But it laid the groundwork for real epidemiology centuries later. Observation and records. Science before science. Some medieval physicians, especially Islamic and Jewish scholars, actually wrote things down. They tracked symptoms, results, diets, and environmental conditions. They studied the stars, sure, but also studied the body. What worked, what didn't, what killed the last 5 patients. In places like Persia and Andalusia, medicine was almost modern. Hospitals, medical schools, surgical techniques, they weren't perfect, but they were centuries ahead of bloodletting by moonlight Europe. So, yes, most medieval medicine was wild, but not all of it was wrong. Sometimes the guess was lucky. Sometimes the fear lined up with good policy. Sometimes herbs did what the saints couldn't, and sometimes the only thing standing between a corpse and a cure was a jar of moldy bread and a monk with a thermometer made of twigs and blind optimism. Fermentation and booze science. One of the greatest gifts medieval people gave to the future was the relentless pursuit of alcohol, which, despite all odds, led to major breakthroughs in sanitation and microbiology. Mead, ale, beer, wine, these weren't just drinks. They were survival tools. Water was usually unsafe to drink, so people turned to fermented liquids, which killed off some pathogens in the brewing process. Unintentionally, they were making a safer beverage. Some healers even infused wine with herbs like wormwood, thyme, and sage, creating what we'd now recognize as medicinal tinctures. Sure, the dosage was often whatever fits in the chalice, but still, herbal alcohol extractions were centuries ahead of their time. Also, people discovered that alcohol cleaned wounds, slowly, painfully, and with much screaming. But it worked better than goat spit, and fewer frogs were involved. The surgical oddballs who got it right. Not all medieval surgeons were butchers with a flair for poetry. Some were innovators. Abulcasis in 10th century Al-Andalus wrote 30 volumes on surgical instruments and procedures, including early descriptions of ligatures and forceps. Guy de Chauliac, a 14th century French physician, survived the Black Death and used that experience to write about quarantine, antisepsis, and wound treatment that actually made sense. Both emphasized cleanliness, observation, and not stabbing things just because they twitched. Radical. Barber surgeons eventually adopted ideas like cauterization with hot irons, which sounds terrible but actually prevented some infections when applied properly. Still hurt like the devil's spoon, but progress. Hospitals that weren't just death hotels. As shocking as it sounds, some medieval hospitals genuinely cared about healing. In Islamic territories, hospitals were open to all, often with libraries and teaching centers attached. Staff included trained doctors, pharmacists, and even female physicians in some cases. In Europe, church-run hospitals focused on rest, prayer, and palliative care. Less focused on curing, more on comforting. But even this helped. Patients were fed, washed, and monitored. Some left healthier than they arrived. Some, notably, medieval hospitals also pioneered. Patient separation by disease type. Diet-based treatment plans. Round-the-clock nursing care by nuns who doubled as field medics with a crossbow. Don't do that again. The rise of medical notes. As medieval universities emerged, especially in Bologna, Paris, and Salerno, scholars began systematically compiling what worked and what didn't. This included case reports, treatment summaries, surgical sketches that weren't just artistic horror shows. These early physicians were the ancestors of clinical researchers. They weren't always right, but they were at least asking better questions, like, why does this plant help? What happens if we don't bleed them? Is this rash supposed to smell like cinnamon? We owe a lot to the scholars who stopped screaming and started scribbling. So, yes, medieval medicine was mostly chaos, equal parts guesswork, fear, and goat-based application. but in the cracks, in the accidents, and in the few who dared to observe rather than incant, there were seeds of actual science. Accidentally brilliant, stubbornly persistent, and occasionally effective. You wouldn't have wanted to be treated in 1349, but you can thank that century for a few things you still use today. Chapter 7. Medieval Medical Myths Still Alive. Today. Think medieval medical nonsense is long gone? Think again. Some of the ideas from the Middle Ages, despite being thoroughly disproven, still linger in modern life like a bad cough in a crowded tavern. Let's examine a few treatments and beliefs that somehow made it across the centuries. Sweating it out. The sweat it out myth refuses to die. Wrap yourself in blankets, crank up the heat, and call it detox. It's vintage medieval logic with modern rebranding. Just skip the chicken tied to your feet. Spoiler, you lost fluids, not demons. But the tradition continues, in saunas, detox wraps, and herbal steam baths sold on late-night TV. Superfood obsession. Garlic, turmeric, vinegar. Today's health gurus treat them like holy relics. Back in the Middle Ages, same story. Garlic was hung from doorposts and shoved up nostrils to fend off evil spirits. Vinegar was sipped like it was ambrosia. Today, we call them superfoods. Then, they were, please God, let this work. Astrology-based wellness. Horoscopes might not guide surgeries anymore, but some people still plan medical decisions around moon phases, zodiac signs, and Mercury retrograde. The stars still whisper, but now they do it through Instagram wellness influencers. Drinking charcoal. Activated charcoal detox drinks are still marketed for cleansing toxins. In the Middle Ages, powdered charcoal was added to elixirs to absorb poison, or just everything. Same idea. Slightly better branding. Crystals for healing. Crystal healing may look modern, but it's a medieval concept wrapped in glitter. Medieval healers assigned stones to bodily organs and planetary forces. Amethyst for headaches, emeralds for digestion, quartz for balancing your humors. Sound familiar? That's because it never really left. So, next time you smudge sage in your living room or buy an elixir labeled Moon Cleansed, remember, you're keeping a 1,000-year-old tradition alive. And hopefully not inhaling hedgehog smoke. Final thoughts? You would not have survived. Let's not sugarcoat it. You, dear reader, would not have made it. You, with your allergy meds, antiseptic wipes, filtered water, and tetanus shots. You, who Googles symptoms before calling a doctor. You, who thinks a mild cold is a personal betrayal of your immune system. You would have crumbled like a damp scroll under medieval pressure. You wake up in 1349 with a sore throat. That's the opening act. By noon, you've been bled, boiled, blessed, and possibly diagnosed with Saturn's grudge. By sunset, you've either been buried under a thin layer of mud or married to a leech vendor's cousin out of sheer survival panic. Even if you avoided the plague, avoided witches, avoided being exorcised into unconsciousness, you'd still have to endure a diet of turnips, disappointment, and holy water. Soapless months. 1 tunic, 0 antibiotics. Medical professionals who use the word miasma unironically. You wouldn't survive a dog bite. You might not survive the cheese, but that's okay. You weren't meant to survive medieval medicine. That's why you live now, where a fever is solved with ibuprofen, not fire, where stitches come with anesthetic, not a stick to bite. Yet despite it all, the horror, the rot, the herbal crimes, those who came before you did survive. Somehow. Their pain, their rituals, their stunning lack of germ theory, all led here, to modern medicine, to you. So raise a glass of filtered water to the brave, foolish, occasionally lucky souls who walked barefoot through filth, swallowed mercury, and called it treatment. Because thanks to them, you get to read this, while wearing clean socks, and that is progress. So rest easy, friend of the modern age. No leeches lurk under your pillow. No barbers with knives await your cough. The worst you face is a slow Wi-Fi signal and the occasional overpriced latte. So, blow out the candle, settle into your clean, plague-free bed, and let the strange comfort of history lull you to sleep. Because if you dream of medieval medicine tonight, at least now you'll understand why that man is waving a fish at your face while yelling about bile. Sleep well. The end.